And joining me are two incredible contemporary scholars and authors. Imani Perry, professor of African American Studies at Harvard University, and the author of many important books, including Black in Blues, How a Color Tells the Story of My People, and South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation. And Eddie Glaude is a distinguished professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and author of many important books, including the forthcoming America USA, How Race Shadows the Nation's Anniversaries. Couldn't think of two people I would rather be in conversation with this morning. Imani, I'll start with you, and I hope the two of you were able to hear some of my conversation with Representative Jones just minutes ago. So, Imani, I guess I want to begin with your reaction to that discussion and what went through your own mind as you saw these images, these protests unfold in Tennessee this week.
I'm glad that people still have some fire in their bones. I think what Representative Jones said is absolutely true. As the South goes, so goes the nation. It is the bellwether of what is happening across the country. Therefore, all eyes ought to be on the South. We have had this long, protracted history of ensuring the protection of constitutional and human rights of all people in this country. And unfortunately, not a full generation after the actual recognition of civil constitutional and subconstitutional rights and voting rights for African Americans, we began to see the process of dismantling that. So 2013, Shelby v. Holder, Section 4B is struck down, meaning that the preclearance formula is no more. So states that have historically tried multiple ways of repressing Black votes suddenly had the freedom to participate in that kind of repression. And now you see the next stage of it, essentially making the Voting Rights Act dead. And so I am demoralized and furious, as many people are, but I am so glad that this long history of fighting to insist upon this country actually being democratic still exists.
Eddie, Memphis, Tennessee is not alone. Do you think that we are watching a coordinated Southern rollback of Black American civil rights?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, it's great to see you, Antonia, and very, very, very honored to be on the panel with Imani. Absolutely, it's coordinated. This is Red Map folk. I forget who the actual title of the organization. This is a part of an ongoing white nationalist agenda that was very much clearly articulated in Project 2025, and they're enacting it. And as Representative Jones was talking, I kept thinking of Malcolm X's words. He said, as long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're in the South. You know, one of the arguments or claims of South to America is that the South is the beating heart of the nation. And so Trump is going to take the Calais decision and he's going to try to extend it across the country. So I think it's really important for us to understand what this is all about. This is not just simply a political will to power. This is a political will to white power. And if we don't name it explicitly at every turn at every chance we get, then we will become complicit in its execution because it's bad faith and bad data that's driving it all. And so I think it is absolutely coordinated, Antonia, and we need to understand it for what it is.
Imani, in the aftermath of all of this, there's a lot of talk, of course, about sort of the electoral strategy. What is the Democratic Party going to do in the face of all of this from the right? But at the same time, when I think about the stories I grew up hearing from my grandparents and my elders, I very much understand that this is not a problem that can be solved by winning one election. This is not a problem that can be solved by one singular politician like an Obama-like figure who comes to save all of us. There are untold numbers of people who put their lives on the line, who lost everything, who were chased out of communities across the South, terrorized, beaten, in order to change the country so that I could be born into at least what I thought was going to be a democracy in which I had rights and the ability to participate. And so to know what the cost of all of that was, and to now be faced, I guess, with the prospect of being back there in that moment again, the sort of post-Reconstruction moment again, what do you think the path forward holds? What does it require from us?
what does it require from us? I think it requires a great deal of fortitude. I think it requires telling that history. One of the things I was thinking about is, Memphis is, of course, the site where Dr. King was assassinated, but he was there because of the sanitation workers' strike. 2 Black sanitation workers had been killed while on duty, in large part because of injustices in how Black sanitation workers and white sanitation workers were treated. And I think, what it becomes a model of is that representation is not simply about winning elections. It is actually about exploitation, violence, various forms of injustice that people confront. And so it's important. It's important for democracy, but it's the tip of the iceberg. And I think, as Eddie said, this is an absolute white power grab. And the question becomes not just whether Black Americans respond to this, but whether all Americans understand this as a violation of the very fundamental principles of democracy and the fundamental rights. We have attacks on human rights. We've seen that with ICE. Now we have attacks on constitutional rights. We see that with the Voting Rights Act, and then very soon, 14th Amendment. And so the question will be, what do we do in response?
Eddie, it's hard to sort of imagine, as someone who's covered protests, movements, and organizing myself my entire career, it is hard to imagine what comes next, because in this post-George Floyd moment, many Black Americans, and I don't need to tell the two of you, they have felt abandoned, whether it's by political actors who pulled away from talking about and advocating for Black community issues or wanting to have conversations about race, or just even abandoned by friends, even in the lead up to what we knew was coming from the Supreme Court on the Voting Rights Act. There were very few Democrats, public figures who were beating that drum and warning people of what was to come. I know the two of you did. But there was a lot of question about, why isn't this more of the national story right now? Why aren't Democrats not just talking about what this means for the midterms or for themselves, what this means for the soul of the country for decades potentially to come long term? And so when you look at the landscape, do you think there is a coalition that's ready to take on all the work that Imani just described there? A coalition bigger than just us?
I have to believe that's the case. Otherwise, I will be overwhelmed by a kind of cynicism and pessimism. But I'm reminded of Frederick Douglass, who lived long enough to see himself free, to witness the Emancipation Proclamation, the ratification of the Civil War amendments, and the first Jim Crow laws passed. And as he was witnessing those Jim Crow coming into being, he talked about the apostles of forgetfulness, that all of those folk who were once anti-slavery, who didn't think that Black folk had the capacity to be citizens in certain ways, right? He understood what I'm calling the great capitulation, those so-called friends who were crying crocodile tears, who wanted us to engage in that great reckoning, racial reckoning, who's now quiet because they are cowering before Trump's power, it seems to me. And so we've been abandoned before by our so-called friends. But I think we have to understand what is required of us. And I don't know if it's going to take the shape of what we saw in the mid-20th century. I understand the rhetorical power of calling it a new Jim Crow, but I also know what's being missed in that moment. I also know that there were 2 pieces of legislation passed in 1965 that they're going after right now. One, of course, is the Voting Rights Act. The other was the Hart-Crane Immigration and Nationality Act, which changed the demographics of the country. They want to go back to an immigration regime that was basically founded by the Klan or created by the Klan in 1924. These things are converging. This is great replacement. And so the question is, does white America have the moral compass to name the devil? That's the key. Because the consultants are telling the Democratic Party that they can't name it because of fear of alienating independents. But can they name the devil? That's the key to this. That's the key question to me. What the movement will look like, I'm not sure, but it can't be a repetition. It's going to have to be something different.
Thank you both, as always. Eddie
I'm sorry,
Glaude.
I talked too long.
No, you did not. Never. If it was up to me and there was no such thing as commercial breaks, I'd probably keep the two of you on for the rest of the afternoon. You know, it's both heartbreaking, but it's uplifting to see your faces. I've admired the two of you for so long. And I know that we'll be having more conversations like this in the months and the years to come on this road. Thank you, Imani Perry and Eddie Glaude.
Thank you.